In this video, we're going to talk about how we can include other JavaScript files from each other in Node. Now, this might be a very interesting concept to somebody who's only done front-end JavaScript development, because typically what happens is you have a website, you have an HTML page, and it has a bunch of script tags, and those script tags specify where the browser goes to grab a JavaScript file, it downloads it, it runs it, and that's the end of it. But unfortunately, as JavaScript has evolved, and especially when Node came about, a really big need to modularize our JavaScript, to be able to have multiple JavaScript files interacting with each other, rose dramatically. And there are multiple ways to do this in JavaScript, but a couple of them are only going to be something you're going to be using on the front end, such as AMD or System.js. In Node, you will use a module system called CommonJS. So CommonJS was specifically designed for Node, and it's a really great module system for working with a server-based application, that might be split into many different JavaScript files. Really, the biggest concern that a person writing a module has are what those modules import, so what other modules are needed, and what those modules export. And every major module system satisfies both of those. They have a way of importing modules and they have a way of exporting modules. So we're going to look at the way Node does it. Now, when I say module, I'm referring to file. So I'm going to use JavaScript file and JavaScript module practically interchangeably because they're pretty much the same thing. The idea is that each JavaScript file is its own little self-contained world. Now, it can ask for other modules, and it can also tell other modules what it will support them doing to it, but otherwise they're all self-contained. So let's go ahead and talk about CommonJS. So again, this is all CommonJS stuff. If you ever see CommonJS, they're referring specifically to the way that we're going to be writing our modules in Node.js. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce another file. So I'm going to go ahead and up here, and I'm going to hit this and come up here, and let's go ahead and create a new file, and let's give it a name. I'm just going to call this calculator. So calculator.js. So that's the name of our file, and it's also going to be the name of, that's our module, calculator. So inside of calculator, for now, I'm going to leave it really simple. I'm just going to say console.writeLine, or console.writeLine. I was thinking document.writeLine for a second there. Console.log, and we'll say from calc. And so this is the code that'll be executed when this file is included. So now jumping back into index.js. We want a way to be able to include this calculator module. So the way we do it in CommonJS is to use the require function. So unlike other module loading systems such as AMD, we can use the require function wherever we want, and what it'll do is it'll synchronously pull in the file. It'll actually go out, the Node runtime will locate the file, it will execute it, and then it'll return a result. We'll talk about what it returns here in a moment. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to say require, and I'm going to say /calculator. Now, // is important. Very, 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 very important. If you do not have the // it's not going to find the calculator module. Now, the reason for this is going to be explained once we start talking about the Node package manager. But for now, just know whenever you have a local module inside of your folder, you want to use // in order to tell Node, to indicate to Node that we're asking for a relatively pathed file. Again, I said I would mention this a couple of videos ago, but I'm going to mention it again. Case sensitivity won't matter on Windows, but it will on other operating systems. So please always use the correct casing. If you name calculator with an uppercase C, which is non-standard in the Node world but possible, when you import it, please use the uppercase C. Of course, it's a lot simpler to name all your modules with lowercase characters, and then so you don't have to remember where the uppercases are. And everyone, both on Mac OS and Linux and Windows, will all be happy and be able to work together. Another thing is path delineators. So you notice I'm using // which is commonly the path delineator for Unix file systems. Fortunately, in Node, you'll be able to use, on Windows, you'll be able to use either the / or the /, which is very common in working in Windows. So I'm going to use the // or // in general to delineate my paths pretty much everywhere so that the code is more compatible with both Unix and Windows-based file systems. Anyway, now that we've done this, let's come back here and let's say node . Or again, we could of course do node index.js if we wanted to, or node index. So if I do node index, not surprisingly, we get this result from calc and then hello world. So we notice that calculator was imported and then hello world was executed. So yeah, there are quite a few interesting aspects of require that need to be mentioned. First of all, what do people think that the result of can't type this would be, for example? I mean, what would people assume would happen? Well, let's go ahead and find that out. You'll notice that we only get a single from calc, and it's above the hello world. First of all, require will cache whatever the module is. So do not use require to execute script-like behavior. So I'll talk about how we can avoid writing script-like behavior in a moment here, but I want to point out another thing. If I go ahead and remove this require at the top and run this code, it will also work, but now the from calc is on the bottom because, of course, we're not including it before here, so it's not getting cached, and then we're doing hello world. Then Node says, oh, you're trying to get calculator. Well, I haven't cached that, I haven't ran that before, so let's go ahead and execute it. And by executing it, we get the from calc message printed out. The other important thing I want to point out here is you can use require anywhere you like in your file. Most of the time, our requires are going to be at the top of the file, but it's going to make sense in a couple instances to have requires in other places. And we'll see instances of those in this video series. I just want to point out it's not required that you have require at the top. And finally, the last thing I want to point out, again, this is synchronously loading calculator. It's like a hash include statement in C++ or a require statement from PHP. It's being synchronous loaded in, which is unlike other module loaders that we'll see later in this course. Anyway, so let's go ahead and remove that. And I'm also going to remove that. Actually, I'm going to do something fun here. Obviously, it's not that big of a... it doesn't seem that useful now because we can run this script, sure, but we're not getting any data back from the script right now. In fact, I can prove that by doing var calc equals require /calculator. And then I can do console.log calc. Now I can come over here and I can type in node index and hit enter. And we'll see we have from calc, which indicates that calc was executed. But then we have this empty object being printed out. So we really need to figure out how is it that we can get data back from our modules, because that's really the only way that modules are going to be at all interesting to use. Well, the way we do it in CommonJS, not necessarily true for other module loading systems, is we use the exports object. So jumping up into calculator, what I can do here is I can reference the Module.Exports. So the module object is an object that's available to us in a CommonJS modules. And it tells us a little bit about the module. It'll tell us what the file name is and fun stuff like that. But it has this very good, very interesting and very important property called exports. So let's look at what exports will do. If I do Module.Exports, I can say equals, and I can assign it to it. I can assign anything to it, really. I can assign an object to it. I can assign a function. I can assign a string. Let's do an object. Let's do function, and then left, right, and then say return left plus right. So we have this basic function being exported. So now what I can do is, because Module.Exports equals this function, if I go ahead and run this over here on node index, I can notice that I have a typo. It's not exoperts, it's exports. And let's do that again. And now we see that what we're getting back is a function. And we can even execute that function. Hopping back over to index.js, for readability, I'm going to go ahead and split my screen here for you guys, so we can look at both files at the same time. I can go ahead and say, instead of saying console log calc, I can say var result equals calc 1020. So I'm passing in these two arguments that correlate to these two parameters here on this function that's being exported. Now if I come back here and type in node index, whoops, I forgot to print my result, ignore me. All right, now that I printed the result, let's come back here, hit enter, and we say from calc and then 30, which is the result of this function. So this function is being executed. Now this isn't particularly something you're going to do all the time, because we have a limitation here. Using this particular syntax, we're only going to be able to export singular functions. And that's commonly not what a module will do. Commonly, a module will export many functions. So right now we say Module.Exports equals this function, but let's do something different. Let's do Module.Exports.add equals this function. So .add, by doing this, is we're not setting the entire object, we're just setting the add property to it. Now, fortunately for us, Module.Exports is already set by default to an empty object, so we don't have to do this before we do .add. So now you'll notice over here, I'm getting an error. And that's because Visual Studio Code is detecting that the exported function here is on the .add property and isn't just isn't being returned into calc. So we're getting an error, so I have to replace this with .add. So now I can have multiple functions being added to my exports. If I hop over into this, I can say node index, and I can say see from calc 30. And I can do this as much as I want. I can say Module.Exports.sub equals function left right, return left minus right, for example, if I wanted to. Make sure you add those semicolons too. And I can say, instead of var result equals add, var result equals sub. Come back here, and we see it works, -10. Okay, so there's another way we can do this, obviously. I just want to go ahead, and now that we get the basic idea of exports and requiring in things, I want to point out we can do a little shorthand here. We can do simply Module.Exports equals an object, and then in JSON notation, we can say add is function left right, return left plus right, and sub is function left right, return left minus right. And now I can go ahead and remove these two export statements completely, and now I have a more compact thing here. And of course we get the same result. Okay, so that's one way to do exports. There's another way, a more common way to do exports, is instead of doing Module.Exports, we can do an alias to Module.Exports. And the alias is simply exports, which is probably more common. You'll probably more commonly see just exports instead of Module.Exports. So for example, I can say exports.add equals function left right, return left plus right. And let's just change this from calc.sub to calc.add, and then come back over here and verify that it's working properly, and it is. Now this is going to be a more common syntax that you'll see. I want to point out that the exports object is an alias to Module.Exports. It is not Module.Exports. So for example, what would you think the result of this program would be? So we have exports equals add, just like what we had before with Module.Exports. And over here on index, we're doing calc.add. So what do you think the result would be here? Well, unintuitively almost, the result will be an error. By the way, if you have never seen a node error before, get used to reading them. It's very important to be able to read these stack traces. They look a little messy. I know they're not colorized, but you get used to it. Now you'll notice that it says calc.add is not a function. But we're doing it right here. We're saying exports equals this object. Well, that comes into play because of the difference between exports and Module.Exports. Exports is an alias. So in the future, whenever you're working with a CommonJS module, always imagine the following lines of code at the top. Always imagine module equals object, stuff, just imagine additional data, exports equals object, and then exports, or var exports, equals Module.Exports. And this would also be a var. Imagine these two lines of code appearing at the top of every CommonJS module, and it might become more clear why this doesn't work. So it doesn't work because exports is an alias to Module.Exports. Assigning a different value to exports does not change the value of Module.Exports. Assigning a different value to Module.Exports does change that value. So be aware of that pitfall. I've seen a lot of frustrated people wondering why their code doesn't work, but it turns out that they were using exports instead of Module.Exports. So yeah, again, the most common way of working with exports is always going to be exports.add function left right, return left plus right. Now, of course, we could always do something like this. Instead of writing our code like this, we can say function add left, right, return left plus right, and then we can say exports.add equals add. And because of JavaScript function hoisting, we're able to reference this function before it's defined. And this is another common way we'll see this code written. And if we come up here, we'll see this. So I just wanted to really drive home just the different ways that you might encounter a CommonJS module being written, how we might interact with the exports variable. I know I spent a lot of time talking about it, but it's really important to have a really good understanding of it, otherwise you'll run into some very difficult debug issues. I want to point out another thing. There are common syntax for requiring in modules. If, for example, we only wanted access to the add function from our calculator, I can simply change it to this. I can say var add equals require dot add. And that's because require just returns our exports object. So we can access the add function up here. We don't even care about the calculator. Now, instead of doing calc.add, we can just do add. Then coming back here and running it, we now see from calc in 30. The last thing I want to point out should be fairly obvious, but I'll just point it out for the sake of completeness. Requiring in files from different directories. So for example, if I created a directory here called services, and I created a file in services, I don't know, let's call it service. Well, that's an awful name, but let's go with that. So let's say service wanted to require in calculator. Notice how they're in different directories. Now the way we require in files that are relative to the current module is, well, just like I said, all require statements are going to be in terms of the relative path of the current module. So I could say var calc equals require ... calculator. Now again, it's important that we do this because otherwise Node will freak out and won't be able to find the module, because this is a relatively path module. And then we can say module.exports equals calc.add 100 plus 200. So we import this and then we export that. And then jumping into index, we can say service equals require. Now, // services service. And now I can say, instead of getting the add result, I can say console log service. It's not really service, it's just a literal integer value. Again, it's really not that exciting. I don't even know why I called it a service. But as you see, we get 300. I guess the last thing to mention is something that I've already mentioned before. Let's say our services has an index.js file in it. So let's create an index.js file here. And in index.js, let's just say exports.service equals, well, that's a silly example. These are all silly examples. Module.exports equals object with hey equals stuff. Doesn't really matter what's in it. All I want to point out is that the services directory now has an index.js file. So I'm sure you guys can see where I'm going with this. If I hop into index.js, I can say stuff equals require / services. And then I can say console log out stuff. And then I can come in here, execute it, and we properly get that. So again, right here what I'm doing is I'm including in a directory, and that directory has an index.js file. This is a very common thing that people will do in their Node modules, where they'll have a bunch of different modules in a directory, and then they'll have an index.js file inside of that directory, and what that file might do is it might export or re-export out all of the other objects that are defined in that entire directory if you wanted to do that. So it's a very common pattern. Another thing I want to point out is this syntax, get used to it. When we require multiple objects, we will be using the syntax, a var followed by a comma-separated list of all the require statements that we might want to use. I don't repeat my vars. I find that really ugly. The comma is significant. Be sure that you add the commas here. Anyway, I think that about wraps this video up, and I guess we'll see you guys in the next one.